She had been saying how much she hated it, how much she was sorry she was there, but that by the time we were leaving, she was saying that she just might come back and do it over again. Then I met my traveler friend, Anne. Travelers son gitanos, indígenas de Irlanda. Anne had meant to meet me there. She was with a group of other travelers who had ridden up together in a hired van driven by a traveler man. They had a rosary bead hanging from the Mira, El Espejo, right through loyalist towns in the north, festooned with the Union Jack, la bandera de Inglaterra. They had been out drinking the night before, and when Anne realized that midnight, when fasting is to begin, was at hand, she said to me, "I ran into a chipper and got some food down me gullet fast." Anne was with 3 traveler sisters, one of whom was her sister-in-law. The sisters were all in black and had come for a penance. They were grieving the death of their brother in a car accident and the subsequent suicide of his young wife. No one had been able to console the young wife, who 6 months after the accident killed herself, leaving 5 young children. I was told by Anne, "The children are the most beautiful you've ever seen. They are Hollywood stars. The parents were Romeo and Juliet. They lived for each other." Anne said, "Now, I'm not saying they didn't have their ups and downs, their fights, but the poor girl could not stand to be left on her own, and she killed herself. May St. Michael save them a bed in heaven." They were all profoundly saddened by this tragedy, the latest episode of which had occurred only months before, and they were deeply compassionate for all concerned. Now, Anne wanted to have their picture taken, and told the sisters how I had photographed herself and her mother at another pilgrimage site in Ireland earlier in the summer, and how much that photo had meant to them. At first, the sisters didn't want their photo taken because they were in mourning and felt it wouldn't be proper. But later they decided they did in fact want a memento of the pilgrimage, and so I took a photograph of them as they were, with their rosary beads wrapped around their hands. They told me that they were there as a penance, asking for strength to accept and deal with the things that had happened, and to go on. It was hard, yet very moving to see these young people with their deep grief and equally strong faith. Anne introduced me then to her own sister. I did a portrait of her as well, and we spent time together in the break room, where she spoke about her own life. A difficult marriage to an abusive traveler husband who had abandoned her and their child some 15 years before. The child, now a teenage boy, was the center of her life, and she had no interest in starting up with any man. It occurred to me that although there were 7 travelers there on Loch Derg, I was the only so-called settled person, non-traveler, talking to travelers at all. And although other settled people would comment on the fact that there were travelers there and that they admired how devout the travelers were, they all know their prayers, they said. They did. The travelers would sit together alone in the front of the basilica, away from all the others. A settled person might say one thing or another in passing to a traveler and be politely answered, but no traveler would initiate anything. There was no hostility, but the distance was very evident. 2 separate worlds. Then it was announced that there would be sessions one could choose to attend in the new conference center. Well, there was nothing else to do, so people chose one or another. Plus, it was bucketing rain outside, pouring. The offerings depend on who's on the island to run them. Our choices included a session of the Rosary, another on matters of faith, and I chose one on the contemporary church. Now, it's a bit strange to come into the conference center, a very big, nearly empty, modern building filled with modern meeting rooms. It shifts the mood somewhat, but ultimately we were still on that island, and by that time it was gray and rainy. And you're with people you've been seeing since you've arrived, and you're all in the same physical state of being. strange and heavy feeling. Your feet are so cold, and you haven't slept or eaten for a day and a half. My session was led by 2 or 3 young men, most likely seminarians, with about 10 pilgrims, men and women. Some of them were quiet, but others spoke about why they were there. A young woman told us she had come for the sake of her sister who had been unsuccessful in her attempts to conceive a child. The sister, though, had phoned that very morning as she was leaving for Al-Akhdar to say that she was expecting a baby, adding, "Now you don't have to go." But the pilgrim sister saw the matter differently. "No, I absolutely have to go to give thanks," she said. Everyone smiled at these happy stories. But the mood changed when a Donegal woman of perhaps 40 years began to speak, wanting to address the topic of the session. She was very clearly old-fashioned, raised rurally, and was the mother of adolescent children. She grew increasingly distraught as she told us that she had been raised in the church and taught to trust everything about it, to give her life over to it. All of us nodded, for of course we had all been raised in that way. But now, she went on, I have these children, and I have a dilemma, because I don't know how to raise them in the church. I can't raise them in the way we were, the way I was raised. I want my children to be good people, to be moral, to have values, but I can't entrust my children to the church. I can't even leave my children alone with a priest. It's what I know, what I believe in, and yet I ask myself when they go out the door to the school run by religious, what am I doing to my children? What do I do? What am I supposed to do? She was clearly confused and very angry. It was terrible to hear all that, to see the pain and struggle for someone like that. It made you sick with fury and disgusted in the deepest way. Most people chimed in supporting her, for we all shared that sense of betrayal and hurt. Everyone there was raised in the church and back on that island voluntarily, looking for something. For if we dropped all that, what would we have? But what we did have was shockingly bad and sometimes evil, and we didn't trust the institution of the church at all. The seminarians were very careful not to defend the church, and there was only one apologist among the pilgrims. I'm sure she was a nun. Nothing can happen overnight, she said. They're working on it, and in good time they'll have it all worked out. But another pilgrim said, this woman doesn't have time. She has to raise her children now, and she can't sit around and wait until these moral cowards get their act together. People nodded in agreement, all of them in the same terrible dilemma. People of faith, sincere believers, but finding themselves in a corrupt institution, and it was clearly very, very painful. Later, there was one last, very long church service, and then we were sent off to bed. Most people seemed very happy they had gotten through it all, and very happy to be going to their beds. One woman had her pajamas on under her clothes, and she laughed as she took off the outer layer. I don't want to lose one moment, she said. I'm a veteran, and I know how to do it. As for me, I slept fitfully. No legendary greatest sleep of your life.
While the routine activities of service and prayer continue into the second day, other dimensions of the experience rise to prominence, the physical as well as psychological struggle. In fact, the two sites most strongly associated with Patrick, the mountain Croagh Patrick and Loch Derg, as well as being national in terms of symbolic meaning and participation, were and are more than nearly all local pilgrimages the most physically demanding. They are both still, when properly done barefoot, and the pain incurred is understood to be central to the experience. This aesthetic element is far more drawn out in the case of Loch Derg, however, and the temporal space between those several days of reflective suffering is linked to another very important difference between the two. And that is, to put it briefly, in the case of Croagh Patrick, you're going up a mountain, And it's quite possible, and many people who do it without any kind of religious thought in their heads, whereas Loch Derg, it's inescapably religious, so you can only think about it that way. The climate, but if the sleeper's sore, cold body is meant to be more susceptible, less resistant to the power of the faith, it turns out that the openness achieved lets things out as well as letting them in. This is meant to happen, of course, in confession, for the form that the ritual takes on the island that Maeve describes is clearly meant to elicit far more than a recitation of sins answered with the recommended penance and absolution, which would be redundant anyway since you're suffering on the island. The face-to-face, visibly emotional, lengthy interaction appears more akin to a therapeutic exchange. But just such a therapeutic mood might also allow for the kind of emotional critique of the church unleashed at the session that Maeve attends afterwards. This kind of interaction is an artifact of more recent developments both within the church and in Ireland generally. The therapeutic idiom, having come like so much in popular culture from the US, is increasingly present and popular among the Irish. But the Irish Catholic Church, like so many others in the West, has also quite self-consciously adopted this mode of thought and action, linking it, of course, to a need for divinity. From a historical perspective, this development can be seen as the latest in that long line of sometimes subtle, sometimes more dramatic shifts in the nature of religious idiom and pilgrimage experience in Loch Derg. To put it another way, the appeal of Loch Derg, or indeed of any religious form, may often lie in the contrast drawn with its understood opposite. In each opposition we find an altered moral geography. The original power of Loch Derg in the context of a united Western Christendom lay in the powerful opposition between this life and an imagined one to follow. In the later context of Catholic versus Protestant Ireland, another key definitive opposition, the practice of pilgrimage took on a more specifically nationalistic dimension, augmented by the growing use of Patrick in the same service. The landscape of Loch Derg was still sacred, but now important in the struggle over the moral geography of the nation of Ireland. From 1790, when the diocese controlled the site, but especially from the 1860s onward, the site became an important one for the newly invigorated and powerful post-famine Catholic Church. No longer under British subjugation and manned by hundreds of Maynooth-trained priests, my university, the church was on a building campaign nationwide, and as we saw, busy on the island as well, erecting buildings to accommodate pilgrims, but also celebrating, if not redefining, the at once national and universal Catholic character of the place through the deployment of crosses and statues. Speaking of their experience in the more recent times, from the 1930s to the 1960s, older men from my own field research site, not far away from Loch Derg, described their collective barefoot walks the 40 miles from home to what was for them, though particularly demanding, and hence more powerful, another in a series of similar pilgrimages to natural healing places and a very powerful religious landscape. While part of their own world, in that sense, they understood that world to be peripheral and backward, Irgulta, west and far back. Which brings us to more recent times and the triumph of the therapeutic. The institutionalization of that approach in Loch Derg can be dated from the early 1990s, with the introduction of two new features, which I think will strike you as particularly modern. One, a counseling service provided by the Sisters of Mercy, and the inauguration of a series of one-day retreats, like other such religious retreats, marketed not in terms of indulgences on the afterlife, but rather a better, happier, more spiritual adjustment to this one. In its contemporary popular usage, spiritual is a usefully ambiguous notion, for although it might be used to indicate the disposition of a religious person, It is often used in contrast to organized religion, as when someone says, I'm not religious, i.e. I'm not a member of a practicing church, but I am spiritual. There is in that opposition often an implication of another one, that is, the spiritual person is more authentically religious than the nominally religious one, or so is implied. Putting aside the obvious echoes of one phase of the Protestant Reformation, it certainly offers a new self-description for the potential pilgrim to Loch Derg. Finally, the sense of spiritual as an interior, emotional, even unconscious state easily absorbs the feelings and anxieties that might otherwise be termed psychological, and references a contrast between the needs of that dimension of the person and the unfulfilling material character of everyday life. In this discourse, Loch Derg is presented quite explicitly on its webpage as another sort of edge to which one travels, away from the center of everyday life of Ireland, of Celtic tiger boom and the global as well as Irish bust of property euphoria and property disaster. And this is what it says on the webpage. Loch Derg, a unique place of peace and tranquility that can offer you peace and quiet from the stresses, hustle and bustle of everyday life. Loch Derg is one of Ireland's oldest spiritual pilgrimages and it's located on an island in Donegal. Be one of the thousands of visitors to experience this place of sanctuary and accept our challenge to, quote, experience something life-changing.
Third day. There is no toast and tea on that third day. We went to the first service of the day, where we were told we had done great, but now had to go out and finish the beds and prayers, the stations. So out we went and scrambled about getting the last prayers in before boarding one of the hourly boats. As soon as my own pilgrimage was finished, I went to the dorm room, put on my shoes, retrieved my camera and equipment that had been held for me in safekeeping, and went right to work because I had permission to do so, which was a great privilege. I just worked with ease and very rapidly. I kind of flew all over the island. I felt very light and was able to work very easily. I had been afraid that I'd have no focus and be very sloppy, but it wasn't like that at all. I worked with complete concentration and focus. I suppose I wasn't seeking or expecting to learn anything artistically through the actual pilgrimage. But for me, there was a rediscovery of the importance of art, of the artistic impulse in human beings. Funnily enough, even when you're a working artist all your life, you can ask yourself, how important is this work that I am doing? Is it relevant to anything in this life? But I rediscovered the importance of art and the impulse to create in the beautiful stained glass windows created 100 years ago by the Irish artist Harry Clark, which were lining the walls of the basilica. They were illustrative of biblical stories, and that's a function, but the important thing for me was the absolute beauty that sustained one through the cold night. The glass alters with the change in the natural light, so you see and feel the passage of time on Loch Derg. It's not flat. Through the dramatically changing windows and of course the light within the cathedral, time is nuanced. Light marks the passage of time and of change, important elements in the whole experience of both art and pilgrimage. The windows are very sweet and fairy tale-like, but it was their luminous beauty that reached inside me and connected me to this artist, who must have been an absolutely beautiful human being. And so I was reminded and reassured of the power of art, the power to create it, and the privilege to see it, and to have an aesthetic sensibility and experience. For all of us pilgrims, whether or not we looked directly at the windows or other man-made or natural wonders that surrounded us on that island, we moved and dwelt among their exquisite forms and passed through the light and shadows. The other thing that was beautiful and sustaining was the music. A girl sang all night, and her exquisite voice resonated through the cathedral. Many of her songs were in Irish, and she had a beautiful, distinctly Irish voice. The music created